Hello, friends. Welcome back to the podcast. Your host, Caroline Offenstein here. And today we have Diana from Healing Birth on the podcast. So, yes, another birth episode. Motherhood just welcomed me with open arms into the obsession that is birth and pregnancy and mom things. And I'm just going with it. I love it. I'm definitely obsessed now. So, welcome. Thank you so much for being here, Diana.
Thank you, Caroline. It's an honor to be here. I'm so excited to talk with you again today.
Yeah, that's right. Because hopefully soon, one or
Yes.
both of us will be sharing my birth story that we recorded for your podcast, Healing Birth.
Yes. I'm so excited to release your story. Yeah,
Yes, that'll be fun. And you're coming to us from Hawaii today, right?
I am. Yes. I live on the northernmost island of Kauai here in Hawaii.
I've heard only good things, but I haven't made it there yet.
Well, if you ever do, let me know. And I would love to show you around and show off how beautiful and sacred this amazing place
Oh,
is.
yeah. What brought you there? Like, I'd love to hear more for you to give like a brief intro to you and who you are, but also like throw in how you ended up in Hawaii because I'm curious.
Yeah, I get asked this question a lot. We I grew up on the West Coast in Seattle, and so we're, a plane ride away from Hawaii. And growing up, I've always spent time here. Like I came here on vacation with my with my family, and I've always been totally obsessed with Hawaii. It's easy to really fall in love with it. It's a very, very special place, obviously. And then after my first son was born 11 years ago, my partner and I started coming to Kauai and completely fell in love with the North Shore of this island. We met friends, we had community here, and we also both had jobs where we were remote. So like my profession at that, no, not at that point. I wasn't podcasting yet, but I had a remote job and he also had a remote job. And so it just worked out that we started spending more and more and more of our time in Hawaii and less time in Seattle. So we'd be in Seattle for part of the year and then it was Hawaii half of the year. And then eventually we just looked at each other and we're like, we obviously want to live here. And so 5 years ago was when we made the permanent move, which was an interesting time to move because we moved at the very beginning of 2020. And like right when we got on island, they shut down tourism and flights here. So in a way, we got kind of lucky, but then in another way, finding a place to live was a nightmare. But that's a whole other story. We're here now, and it's been such a gift to raise my boys really close to nature. And I love the culture here and the people here. It's just really, it's an incredible blessing to be here. So that's basically the story of how we got here.
Wow. Yeah, like you said, good timing, right? Because you got in
Yeah.
just in time, but also hard. Like I moved in 2020 and it was really hard at first to make friends and community because no
Yeah.
one was going out. And that was like, it was a good time to move, but a hard time to move for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I can relate to that big time.
But so cool. And you have two sons, right?
I do. Yes,
And how did you, oh yeah, please share.
they're now 11 and 8.
Okay. And how did you get into the birth space? Because you weren't always in the birth world, right?
No, not at all. I was in the corporate world. I mean, that whole story starts with the birth of my first child. And I can just start talking about that if you're interested in hearing about that.
Yeah, please.
So, when I became pregnant with my first baby, I knew that I didn't want to participate with like the mainstream medical system. I didn't want to have obstetric care. I could see a lot of the problems with it. And my background in the corporate world was working within the health insurance industry. And I worked for the largest carrier. If you've ever had health insurance in the United States, I've worked for the company that gave it to you. And in that role, I had a really interesting job, or I had an interesting role where I touched a lot of different parts of the company. So, like, I worked with underwriting, I worked with care management, I worked with upper management, I worked a lot with sales and marketing. And so I got to understand that part of the healthcare system really, really well. And I saw some things that really didn't add up and really, really bothered me. And growing up, I also had a dad that was very chronically ill. And I watched the medical system just like really fail him, like really fail him. And so as a young woman, I just kind of never wanted to participate with any of that at all. And I've always been healthy, thank God. And so I hired a midwife with that baby and planned a home birth. And I had a super easy pregnancy. I was very like naive in a way. I really wasn't afraid of birth. Now, having done it twice, I'm like, oh, it's really big. You should maybe have a little fear. But yeah, I had a healthy pregnancy. Everything was fine. And then my birth experience is what completely shook up my entire world with this baby. So I went into labor at 41 weeks and had kind of a very typical start to my labor pattern. Um, and I won't get into all the details, but like it went on kind of a long time, like around the 24-hour mark. My midwife was telling me, Diana, you seem really tired. I think we should transfer.
Mm.
And yeah. And I think she was tired, honestly, because she had been there
Yeah.
all night long. And I was also, I mean, you've had a home birth, you know what this is like. Like I was probably like 8 centimeters dilated on a different planet. I was not capable of speaking. I was not capable of thinking clearly. Like, so when she said that to me and to my husband, the only thing I could compute was something is wrong.
Yep.
And I should also mention that, like, deep down, like, I knew nothing was wrong with my son. I could feel him kicking. I could feel him moving around. Obviously, they were checking heart tones throughout the whole night, and there was nothing wrong. And I even later debriefed this with my doula and my husband to make sure I'm not misremembering something about this because I was in labor. And they both confirmed that nothing was actually clinically wrong, but she kept saying, "You're tired. Like, I think we should go in." And so we transferred to a local hospital. And what happened at the hospital is they did all the hospital things. I remember arriving there and just feeling, I was still in like way active labor. Like I would like take a couple steps and hit the floor on my knees, having a contraction. I mean,
Yeah,
it
so let's
was,
just make you get in a car and go somewhere and like, oh my God.
yeah, I was like not capable of doing anything. I was not capable
Mhm.
of doing anything at this point. And so they kind of treated it like it was an emergency, even though it wasn't really. And they did all the things to speed up my labor. So they broke my water, gave me an epidural that I didn't ask for, but I just wasn't really able to communicate what was going on. And then,
Oh yeah. You don't have
yeah,
to tell
and then,
me.
yeah, I know, yeah. And so then I'm pretty sure they put Pitocin in my IV drip.
Mm.
And then the baby had concerning heart tones after that, which obviously, yes, we all know what the cascade of interventions is, which is exactly what happened to me. And then it was an immediate emergency cesarean, which was honestly one of the most traumatic experiences of my entire life, and something that left me with PTSD, flashbacks. I probably would have been diagnosed with postpartum depression as well. And it wasn't just the acute trauma of that experience, but it was also like the disconnect where I I couldn't wrap my mind around how this had happened to me because like I knew that this is what happens in hospitals. I knew the term, the cascade of interventions. I was not ignorant to these things. And I realize now in retrospect, in many years of reflecting upon this and many years of hearing other women's stories, is that I didn't realize how medical midwifery can bring some of the hospital to you and some of the problems with medical midwifery. Like, I know there are wonderful midwives out there who just want to serve moms and babies, and I'm not trying to say anything negative. But I think that there are some midwives that practice defensively and have a very low risk tolerance. And I'm not sure exactly what was going on with my midwife, but I don't think she transferred me for a good reason. And it caused a lot of trauma in my family. And I think it's important to mention too that my son, who had that birth experience with me, he has some health issues going on. He's 11 now. That no doctor would ever validate this, but I strongly believe that the way that he was born affected him a lot. And we've been on a healing journey for him ever since then. But I like to point that out, not to be a victim, but to say caring about having a peaceful birth experience has so much more to do than the experience itself. A peaceful birth experience and a physiological birth experience can have, I should say, years and years and years of effects on the quality of your life and your child's life. And so that was the first story. And
Mhm.
I can pause here if you have any questions, or I can tell you what happened next.
I do have questions, but I think keep going and keep,
Okay.
yeah, diving into birth and like this fueling your interests and all that. Yeah.
Okay. So I didn't want to think about birth at all after this experience. In
Mm.
fact, I thought I would never give birth again. I wasn't even really interested in like going to therapy or healing. I just didn't want to think about it. I just wanted to put it in a box and put it in my closet and just, I just thought like, well, I failed at this and I'm probably not a very good mom. And, I had all these feelings of shame and guilt, and it was just awful. But then, of course, God sent me another baby totally unexpectedly. I became pregnant when my oldest was about 18 months old. And I was so terrified and so scared when I found out I was pregnant again. But even in those initial like first days of being freaked out and scared, there was this tiny little seed inside of me that was like, Diana, this might be your second chance to give birth, but also to heal that first experience through reclaiming this experience in a positive way. And so the initial hurdle that I encountered was that I lived in a state where it was not legal for midwives to attend a VBAC mom at home, which is so crazy. So I thought that, and I think that the law has since changed, by the way. This was 8 years
Was that
ago.
Washington State
Washington
then?
State.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Crazy. So I thought initially that my option was just I had to go back to a hospital, but I knew in my gut I would never feel safe there, and I knew I needed to be home. And I didn't really know how to figure out how to stay home. At that time, I still thought I needed to have someone there. I probably now would choose to free birth, knowing what I know now. But at the time, I still, I was just at the level that I was then, and I thought I needed someone there. And
Oh, wait, real quick.
yeah,
For anyone listening who doesn't know, VBAC is vaginal birth after cesarean. Just wanted to throw that in there.
thank you. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. I should not assume everyone knows that term. Yeah, a vaginal birth after cesarean. So I was like sitting and praying and thinking about this dilemma one day, probably around 15, 16 weeks pregnant with the second baby. And I had this sudden remembrance, this memory flash into my mind that I knew someone who had walked this path, who had done this. I knew someone who had casually mentioned to me, very casually actually, that she had had a cesarean with her first baby and a home birth with her second. She lived in my state. I knew her personally. And then I remembered that I had her email. And I was like, well, I'm going to email her. So I emailed her, and God bless the sweet woman. She immediately emailed me back and gave me great advice. She told me to get in touch with the local ICANN meeting, which is ICANN, another acronym there is the International Cesarean Awareness Network. They are an international group that is here to support women who are all along the spectrum of the cesarean issue. I think they primarily help women have a VBAC because that's mostly what women mostly want. But if you need to find, if you have to have a cesarean and you need to find like a certain type of provider, they can help with that too. It's a really wonderful organization. And I got in touch with them. And what I learned was that there is this underground list of midwives that were willing to basically defy the law. I mean, it's not to say a law is probably too extreme. It was not within the scope of their license. So their license did not allow them to
I see.
attend. Yeah. So it's not like it would be a felony, but it was, it was a risky thing for them to do. And
Would they like
so
lose their license? Is that how that works?
potentially, yes,
Okay,
yes,
okay.
they could lose their license for doing this.
Hmm.
But I mean, I'm grateful to midwives like that because obviously any midwife that's willing to do this really believes in women's autonomy and that we should be able to make these decisions, that we're not dumb little children, that not that children are dumb, but that we don't need to be infantilized by the medical system and told that we can't possibly know where is safest for us to give birth. We do know. So I got this little list and I found a midwife. And I was like, okay, that's what I'm going to do this time. And that pregnancy, I spent so much time um, dealing with fear, healing, taking really, really, really good care of myself. and basically doing everything that I thought was within my power to have a different birth experience the second time. All
Can you
while, yeah.
can you give some quick examples of that? Like, because you started, obviously, like this is already empowering, right? Like the people you've reached out to and what you're doing. But like when you say I was taking really good care of myself, I'm specifically curious of like the mental side. Were there any things that really stood out to you?
Yeah. I did a couple of things a couple of things that I found really helpful. And this is such a minor, small thing, but it really helped me. Was that if I ever felt fear, or if I ever felt like I was thinking about this birth with fear, what if, I just forced myself to sit down and start a gratitude list. And
Mm.
it could start out really small. Like, I like the shirt I'm wearing today. Brad was really sweet to me this morning. The breakfast I ate was great. Really super simple things, but I would force myself to make it to 10. And by the time I got to 10, it was like I had pulled myself out of a fear state, and I was in a different vibe completely. And I usually found I could keep going and continue writing things that I was grateful for. And it completely shifted my mindset every single time. Another thing that I did was I did a birth hypnosis. And I've talked about this publicly before, and I've had listeners reach out and say, "Where can I find this practitioner?" And I could never find her again. So I'm so sorry if someone's listening and they want to know more about this. But I did some hypnosis with someone who specializes in birth trauma. And we went through and visualized this whole new, different birth experience. And I think we did some hypnosis around the first birth
Mm.
experience too. And that was helpful. I did a lot of yoga, a lot of mindfulness, breathwork stuff. That was all really helpful. I ate extremely, extremely well, really paid attention to my nutrition. I'm sure that was helpful too. And so that was like the healing stuff that resonated with me. I don't think it has to look that way for everybody, but that's just kind of what it looked like for me. And at the same time, I also kind of needed to let go and realize that, no matter what happens, I actually am not really in control. I've done the best that I can to set myself up for success, but I'm actually not really in control of this at all. And that's the hardest part, I think. Like, doing healing work is kind of fun, but doing the letting go part, like that part's really hard, I think.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. So I remember, I'll just take you to the end of that pregnancy at 40 weeks. I had this really interesting supernatural experience where I had just met with my midwife, and it was 40 weeks. So we were just kind of chatting about the birth. I don't even remember what we did, probably just talking. And I left her place, and I remember stepping on the pavement outside of her place, walking towards my car, and I got this immediate download, like a supernatural download, that my baby was going to be born and that it was going to be really, really good. It was like a knowing that came from somewhere else that was not me. And it didn't stay with me forever. It was like, it was like with me for a moment, a complete knowing. And then it kind of like went away. And I was like, that was amazing. It was probably one of the most supernatural experiences that I've ever had. It's hard for me to put it into words, but it was definitely a gift, a huge gift as I prepared to birth this baby. And in fact, that very night, I woke up in the middle of the night in labor, and it was like hard and fast, immediate labor. There was no question in my mind that it was labor. And I kind of tried to labor on my own without waking up my son and my husband for as long as I could, but that only lasted about 2 or 3 hours. And I think somewhere around 4 a.m., I woke up my husband and said, "We need to call the doula and the midwife because I think this baby's coming fast." And it was fast and hard and painful, but my baby was born in my bed right at about 8 a.m. I caught him myself and pulled him up onto my chest, and he was wide awake and alert. And that part was so healing because my first son was born on drugs, and I was on drugs when I met him. And so both of us were just not there fully. And to have like an alert baby, like, of course, getting to birth him and getting to complete that somatic process of the birth process was hugely healing for my body and my psyche. But man, having an alert eyed baby just look at you like, "Mom, it's me." It was incredible. And the healing that I experienced from this birth experience, and the healing that really kind of rippled out into our family, was so profound that, in the months afterwards, I just thought I got to talk about this because I know I'm not the only one who's had a traumatic birth experience. I know there's an epidemic of it actually.
Mm.
And if I can do this, I mean, anyone can. I'm not uniquely broken or uniquely special. And the healing and the power of it was so profound. I just felt like I need to dedicate my life to this. And so at first, I thought that I wanted to work with women who had experienced birth trauma exclusively because I, first of all, knew exactly what it was like. I had a deep level of empathy and zero judgment because I had been there. But then on the other hand, I had had this healing birth experience that was so powerful. I felt like the two were integrated enough that I could really sit with someone in their pain and not be also pulled down into victimhood, but also understand what they were going through, if that makes sense. And so I did that for a while. I received some training with Birthing from Within to be a birth story listener and do birth story medicine. And I liked that, but after a while, it just occurred to me that if I had a podcast, I could reach so much more people if I was just speaking into a microphone with a woman one-on-one. And so that was 5 years ago. And 5 years ago, I began the podcast Healing Birth. And my podcast really is for anyone like myself who has had a hard birth experience that left you feeling pain or trauma or shame or guilt or any negative emotions. It really is for you. I share a lot of stories that are like my own of people that have had a really challenging experience and then a really uplifting one because I love to illustrate that it does not have to be the same the next time. It can be completely different. I think that hope is something that women really need sometimes. I know I wish I had someone say that to me when I was postpartum with my first baby. So, and I also share I share really all I actually don't have a specific niche because I feel that in the years that I've been doing this, what I've learned is that all birth stories are very powerful, almost no matter how they happen, because there's something in it for someone. And I've never heard a birth story, even a birth story of a woman who made choices that I wouldn't make, where I didn't learn something very important from her. And it's such a privilege to hear women's stories. Every single woman has a big story in her life, and to get to sit with her and hear those stories and share them on the show has been, I thought that the show would be for others. Here's my gift to you, but it actually feels like it's been a massive gift to me too. And so, yeah, I've been doing that for 5 years, and that is now what I do professionally full time.
Awesome. Wow, 5 years. Yeah, I don't think I knew that because I found your podcast sometime last year.
Cool.
Just like I thought I would stop listening to birth stories after I had a baby, and it has not stopped. I can't get enough, especially of ones like you talked about where there's kind of almost a redemptive quality to subsequent babies. And yeah, I'll just echo what you said. Like sometimes I'll read what I think the episode is going to be about, and I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to jive with this one, but I'll listen to it anyway. And there is always a takeaway, right? No matter what the story is. And I do think part of me when I was listening to birth stories when I was pregnant was nervous that it was, I don't know, going to make me like get in my head or something. But now that I've listened to so many, I think it's only just more and more helpful because you learn like in a different way. And it almost, I think the more that you listen to, the more it actually decreases pressure because
Mhm.
you see so many different situations and how and like women learning from hindsight being 2020 and like their takeaways and your own takeaways hearing their story. And it's, yeah, there's something just really magical about it, I think.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree with you. I feel that 5 years of listening to hundreds of birth stories has only made me trust birth more. And I can talk more about why I say that, but my trust in the physiologic, undisturbed blueprint of birth is so much stronger now. And it's from listening to all kinds of stories. All kinds of stories sort of point towards the same conclusion. Um, yeah, it's really awesome.
I would love to hear more about that because I was going to ask, like, what are some, obviously, it's hard to distill hundreds of birth stories down into some key, I don't know if takeaway is probably not the right word, but just I kind of want to say magic again, like the magic that you see in women or in birth or whatever comes to mind when you're like, if I did distill down all of these hours and hours of stories I've listened to, what are some things that stand out to you?
This is what I hear over and over again. And by the way, I don't filter for certain types of women or certain types of stories. So my podcast is not a podcast full of crunchy women or any other type of woman. This is, but, and so given that it's a demographic of literally everybody all over the world, this is what I hear over and over and over again. And it's illustrated in different ways. When birth is left almost completely undisturbed, unmessed with, and when a woman feels safe and secure and surrounded with people that care about her and that she loves, birth unfolds really, really well. When birth is interfered with medical interventions or energetic interventions or fear interventions, complications happen that alter the safety, the inherent safety of birth. I hear this in birth stories. I hear this in home birth stories. I hear this in free birth stories. In 5 years and hundreds of stories, I can think of two stories, only two, where a woman had a completely undisturbed birth and something strange happened, something that required attention happened. Only two. And again, I do not filter for these stories. So that tells me that the inherent design of birth works if we don't mess with it. And you know, Caroline, it just makes perfect sense because I don't know if you've ever like been to a zoo and there's been a birthing mammal, in the zoo, and everyone will be like, don't go to that place, that mom is birthing, we're leaving her alone, we're not going to disturb her. Everybody knows in the animal kingdom that that's what you do with a birthing cat or a birthing dog. And we do almost literally the exact opposite to birthing humans. And so the stories that I hear, they all reinforce this. And it's interesting because even if the woman who I'm interviewing isn't aware of it herself, like if she's at a level of consciousness where she's like, the doctor saved me, I can still hear in her story where they actually really didn't. There was an intervention that caused the saving to have to happen in the first place, if that makes sense to you. I can always hear it. I always pick it up now. I'd like to share another thing that I've learned. This is super fun and super, well, it's beautiful and it's magical. I noticed this theme of babies coming in when other family members are transitioning out, like
Mm.
dying, going, passing on. I constantly notice this theme of like either a pregnancy happening when someone in that woman's family is dying or just has died, or a birth happening, and then like there being a death in the family happening really close to the birth. And I hope that doesn't sound dark. I actually think that it's really beautiful because it feels like a divine orchestration of some kind. And I've heard it so many times that I just can't believe that that is a coincidence either. I like to believe, I don't know how any of this works, but I like to believe that there is a rhyme and a reason to when we come onto planet Earth and when we leave, and there's a reason behind all of it. And I do see that reflected in the stories that I hear. And that always kind of gives me chills when I hear it.
Yeah, it's a hard reality, I guess, the way that you're stating it. But I do hear a lot of people in the birth space talk about accepting death like we accept birth, and a death that's almost like it's interesting because it is like, I don't want to talk about it. We leave it alone. There's not a lot of transparency always around that. And it's almost like the opposite with birth. Like you said, in most settings today, it's like, let's shine the bright lights. Let's do all the attention. It's an emergency. It's a big deal. But yeah, it seems like there would be a lot more peace if there was more balance between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree.
And then what about, I saw one of your posts recently about the hard part of labor, the transition part, the I can't do this part. And I think you mentioned that you hear that from a lot of women too, of like there's usually that point that we all get to of I can't do this. I know I certainly had that point. I'd love to hear it in your words again, though, of just like what have you heard about that point of transition? Or even, I mean, I think a lot of people probably think that throughout their pregnancy too, and have moments of maybe if they're planning a home birth or a free birth of those doubts and those fears coming up, like we talked about, but then also ultimately in labor that usually comes up too. And what have you seen in regards to getting to the other side of that? Like, what does that look like?
Um, this is what I can say. Transition is something that every woman who's birthing without drugs physiologically hits. And there's actually a physical reason for it. There is a rush of adrenaline that happens right before her baby's about to emerge. And I think it's cortisol too. Someone else who knows more about the matrix of hormones might be correcting me on that. But there's a specific hormonal spike that happens right before the final pushing phase, and that's usually when the mom has this sudden like panic feeling, like you want to get out of your skin, and you just realize that, wow, this is just too much. It's too big. I can't do this. I mean, you said you experienced that. I remember very vividly. I think I said, take me to the hospital. I can't do this.
With your
And
second?
obviously, yeah,
Yeah.
obviously I didn't mean it. Thank God no one took me seriously, but I really thought I couldn't do it. And in thinking about this phenomena that we experience, this, transition phase, I really believe in the wisdom of birth and how birth unfolds. And I've come to think of this point in our labor where we are convinced that we cannot do it, it's too hard, it's too big, the baby won't come out, is actually really important because when you do then do it, you have this feeling that you cannot do it, and then you do it. And so then when you do it, there is this feeling of I can do absolutely anything. I don't know if you felt that. I know I sure did. I thought I can do anything. If I did that, I can do anything because I believed that I could not do that. And I did it. And that is so key. I think that is a powerful initiation into motherhood because when you are a mom, it doesn't it doesn't end with pregnancy, it doesn't end with birth, it doesn't end with infancy. You're now a mom forever. And forever there's going to be challenges and hard things that come up within mothering. It just is part of it. And you have to be able to trust yourself. You have to be able to trust yourself over perceived authorities that might be telling you something about your child that you don't agree with or you think is wrong. And so that part in our labor that I'm so sad that it gets bypassed with I don't want to I mean anyone who's had their baby on drugs, I say this with no judgment because I did too. So trust me, I have no judgment in my heart for you at all. But I'm sad that that experience gets bypassed a lot with epidurals and other drugs that augment our labor because I think that transition, I don't think of it anymore as this awful hurdle to get over it. I feel that it's a very important part of the whole process. And part of what, it's part of the initiatory gift of labor.
I would add to that too. This is why physiologic birth is so important because part of that then would be a natural transition into the postpartum period, right? Where you're bonding with your baby, where you're breastfeeding, you're resting, hopefully hydrating and all of that too. But yeah, like as you're saying that, I can see this chasm that was created in my story because my midwife freaked out when I don't even know if there was any inherent risk with what happened with me, and we rushed to the hospital, and it really caused this rift, this chasm in what should have been that moment of like, I did this, I got through it, because I did feel that right away, but like an hour later it was just like complete panic and chaos. And so that was like interrupted, right? It was like diminished, maybe is another way to say it. And that did lead to a lot of me questioning myself in postpartum and feeling, I don't want to say powerless, but like disempowered maybe in a lot of what came next. So, and it really does feel like a lot of that just like zapped. It like zapped away when all the chaos started happening and I transferred postpartum. So I can totally, yeah, I can totally see what you're saying and see the importance of that. And so you touched on, epidural cesarean. I wanted to talk more about that too. And I know you have a lot of resources on VBAC and recovering from cesarean and stuff like that on your website. And I saw you use the term unnecessarian, which I would love for you to get into because I think this is something that a lot of people don't understand. And maybe it's partly because of what you mentioned, which I had this haze too for at least 6 months postpartum where I thought my midwife had saved me. I thought doctors had saved me. And then I start talking to more people and processing more, and they're like, what was the risk? What was even wrong with you? And I'm like, you know what? I don't know. I don't know if there was any risk. That was never explained to me. And I think a lot of people who also have cesareans are like, well, oh, it was, the doctor saved me. It was a total emergency. And sometimes I don't say anything or ask anything. Sometimes I'll try to ask gentle questions and I'm like, what? What? Like what was happening? So could you touch on that a little bit and maybe even we can get into epidurals a little bit too?
Yeah, and I'm going to answer your question kind of more philosophically than scientifically. I don't feel that I am qualified to get into the medical details of when is a cesarean necessary. So I'm just giving you my opinion as a non-medical professional and on the epidemic of unnecessary cesareans. I believe that we have a completely broken maternal healthcare system that creates the problems that it then saves us from. And I think this is absolutely true of cesarean sections. I think there's also a nefarious aspect to this conversation because of how lucrative cesarean sections are for the hospital and how much many obstetricians, I'm going to use the term, like doing them because they're trained surgeons. They got into that subspecialty because they're surgeons. They surgeons like to perform surgery. So I think that it is a hugely underestimated and underreported epidemic of unnecessary cesareans that we have certainly in our country. And I will say that, I mean, of all of the cesarean births that I've heard, I've never heard of a single one where there wasn't an intervention that happened before the cesarean section that I can easily see caused I'm using air quotes, necessity of the surgery. And I think that my story.
You got balloons from your hair quotes.
I don't know
Oh,
what that was.
Zoom is killing us.
All right, Zoom. Um, I was gonna say that certainly illustrated in my story as well. Like I didn't need to have that surgery, but I mean, how many women would come away from my story and think like, yeah, that needed to happen? I mean, women do believe that, and I think that that's self-protective. And I think that I would never ever pry or try to get a woman to change her mind because that's just not my place. And I think that in some ways it might be easier to think that what was done to you was necessary. And I would like to point out that that is a trauma response. That's a trauma response, whether you had an unnecessary cesarean or if you were beaten by your husband and you have battered wife syndrome. It's traumatic. Did I touch on what else do you want me to say about that?
Well, just to throw some numbers with that, at least from my understanding, I'm obviously not an expert in this either, but from my understanding, the US cesarean rate is like 33%, right?
Yes, that is
And then
correct.
what is deemed by like health organizations to be, there's what, like 5 to 10% of all pregnancies like will probably have an issue that does require cesarean, which
Mhm.
I don't know where that number comes from, but that's 5 to 10% versus 30%. So that means 20+% of women who have cesareans, it wasn't actually necessary. So
Well, I would also like to point out, though, that even if you accept the numbers by the 5 to 10% number, even if you accept that that is a valid number, within that number is included births like breech births and twin births, because the medical establishment does not like accepted medical protocol is that you give those babies a cesarean. So how what is it, like maybe 5% of births already could be breech or twins or multiples of some kind? I don't know exactly how those stats work out, but I would just like to point out that even within those parameters, I think that I would not make the assumption that cesareans are necessary in all of those circumstances. I mean, certainly evidenced by all of the women I know who have had breech babies and twin babies at home. It's not something that is inherently risky to do.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Good point. I didn't know that was included because yeah, breach is something that so many people get freaked out about. And I don't know if it's like the algorithm or whatever, but like I feel like I always see a birth video on my feed of a breech baby, like free birth or home birth. And it's like, does it look challenging? Like, yep, birthing babies is a challenge, but it's fine. It is what it is. It's a variation of normal that a lot of people call it. So, I mean, we just had Audrey from A Joyful Birth on the
Yeah,
podcast.
I saw that. Yeah.
And yeah, she had breech two breech babies. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
it's not
I,
a need for a cesarean. Yeah.
I love her story. I remember she vividly described, she was on my podcast too, and she
Mm.
vividly described what it felt like to birth a breech baby. And she said it felt like a loaf of bread. Like that was the term she used. That was so funny. A lot of the moms that I've had on have said that their breech deliveries were easier and faster than their head down deliveries, which again, to me, kind of makes sense because if you want if the baby is being birthed that way, you probably want it to be birthed fairly quickly. I mean, you certainly don't want it to be a long, slow labor. I can think of reasons why you wouldn't want that. And so again, it just feels like I'm hearing examples of the wisdom of the body come through, even in a quote unquote, a birth where there's a positioning problem. The body still knows what to do in those circumstances, anecdotally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned, I kind of want to get back to this, your health insurance career, because I have been self-employed for, I don't know, 10 years, close to. So I've had, for anyone who doesn't know, like if you're self-employed, you do not get hooked up on the health insurance. You get screwed no matter what your health is, especially through like the totally bullshit label of the Affordable Care Act. It is bananas expensive.
Crazy.
Bananas. Like, I don't know how that is supposed to be affordable. I think we were quoted like almost $2,000 a month for my
Hmm.
family, who no
Yeah,
one is on meds. We don't really go to the doctor. Like, what? So we got private insurance this year, which is still super expensive, but it's less. It's less than the Obamacare Affordable Care, which is just insane. But I mean, you kind of alluded to some things with birth, which we can focus on that if that's what you're like kind of most comfortable sharing about. But yeah, I would just like love to hear more your perspective on how all that works. And like, you already kind of had this, I don't know about that feeling with the Western medical system. Like, can you share a little bit more about that?
I can. Um, I'll start with something that was a really huge wake up call for me when I was working within that industry. I don't know if health insurance companies are still doing this, but about 10 years ago, when I was working in the industry, if you think about the way a healthcare insurer makes money, they want to have healthy people in the pool, putting money into the pool, and then that pays for the sick people who are overutilizing, really expensive cancer treatments or something like that. That's a gross oversimplification, but that's basically how their business model works. And so there is this concept of really, really promoting preventative preventative healthcare, meaning you go in every year, you get a mammogram or whatever, do whatever, I don't know what tests guys are supposed to do, but usually under a health insurance plan, those sorts of services are covered at 100%. And the idea philosophically behind that is that, well, the more that you access preventative care, the healthier your population will be because you'll catch cancers, you'll catch problems early. And so that will contribute to the overall health of the pool and will prevent more expensive costs later on. I sat in underwriting meetings where they talked about this idea. And it's so interesting to reflect on this because now the way that I think about health is so much differently now. And I know that the last time you and I talked, we chatted briefly about German new medicine and taking those concepts into mind when I think about that approach to health, it makes perfect sense to me that the results that the health insurers Because again, I could see all the claims data and I could see it all aggregated at a very high level, like thousands and thousands and thousands of people. The bottom line is this: the more healthcare you access, the more you do any kind of test, any kind of procedure, the more healthcare you access. Meaning, think of the example of you go and you get a mammogram, they see something, they're not really sure what it is. So you come back and you do a biopsy. And then from the biopsy, you have follow-up pains. You see them again. And it turns out there's nothing fine, but then because you've already been flagged and you have that titanium chip in your breast, now you're going in more often. Do you see where I'm saying? Do you see the pattern I'm getting at? So it was kind of mind-blowing for me to, and no one, by the way, there was a huge level of cognitive dissonance. Like no one was saying this out loud, but I was looking at claims data and going, wait a minute, accessing the doctor more doesn't make you more healthy. Like that's just what the data said. And no one was like saying that part out loud. But for me, that was one of the really huge red flags where I was like, huh, this system is not really set up to create healthy people. And I also sat in underwriting meetings where we're looking at like a small, like a very small company, like say like a towing company or something that had maybe 6 employees. And they received insurance through like a trust that was a subsidiary of like our company. And I remember the underwriter looking at the claims data and saying, well, Bob has prostate cancer. So this is going to be expensive and we're going to jack up their rates and we're going to get him out of the pool. Literal words. And I remember like, again, like kind of looking around the room, like, is this legal? Is that even, I mean, obviously it's not moral or ethical, but it's not, it's, that shouldn't happen. And so I'm not surprised to hear that you've been completely screwed by health insurance companies. I don't want to bash anyone in that industry or any particular company. I really do see it as one part of one entire broken system, the entire medical system. I don't know, like, okay, I should say I'm pretty extreme. My views are probably pretty extreme compared to normal people when it comes to this issue. So I don't know how truthful you want me to be, but
Oh, please. I
okay.
want to hear it.
I just think that the medical system is completely broken and doesn't really serve to make us healthier, and also doesn't really understand the human body the way that they as an entity thinks that it does. And so I just see the whole health insurance world as like that's just another arm of it. And it's all very sad. I think it creates more problems, more tragedies, more sickness actually, and more death than if there's a better way. So if you
Mhm.
have any other questions, I'm happy to answer any other questions about my time there. It was very eye-opening and I learned a lot.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that because I think it's just, I don't know if I've ever actually talked to anyone who has worked in the health insurance field. I just have had my own crappy experiences over the years, and you don't really hear a lot of good experiences unless, well, you know what you do hear is people who have had a corporate job for however many years and they're like, oh yeah, the benefits. And like people
Mhm.
stay at jobs for benefits.
I
Like that's
know.
how, like that feels super corrupt, you know, that
It
like you
is.
have to work a job because otherwise if you want to go to the doctor, it's going to be like hundreds of dollars. I mean, literally when I didn't have insurance over the years, like a random visit to the doctor is like 350 up to maybe $500
Yeah.
for someone to talk to you for 5 minutes and they don't even understand your biology. Sometimes
Right.
I feel like I
Yeah.
remember going to the dermatologist last year and before I really dove into GNM, and I remember asking her, I'm like, well, what about like diet? I mean, you can't seriously tell me that what I'm eating has no effect on my skin. And she's just like, yeah, no, it's not something you're eating. And I'm like, do you understand what an inflammation response is in the body? Or like, do you literally only understand how to, you know, biopsy for skin cancer and write prescriptions? I mean, it's
That's what they're taught.
insane. It's insane. And so when you think about that, and then you think like coming back to birth, are OBs even taught or shown truly natural birth of a woman just laboring and ah
No, they've never seen it. I can give you a funny anecdote. I just interviewed a woman and she found out she was pregnant. She went to her OB and her OB was like, oh, well, how do you know you're pregnant if you haven't had an ultrasound yet? And she said, well, I know because I've been tracking my cycles and I know when I ovulate and I didn't bleed and I took a pregnancy test and I know that I'm pregnant. I know I'm about 6 weeks pregnant. And she's like, well, no, you can't possibly know unless you had an ultrasound. And this woman, she looked at me, she's like, Diana, it was like she didn't even understand the menstrual cycle. And I'm like, I don't think she does. Like
Maybe she
they're
does.
not being taught that. They're not being taught. I don't think that, yeah, I don't think an obstetrician has ever seen a physiological birth. I don't even know that that can happen in a hospital with strangers around you and bright lights. And yeah, it's actually, Caroline, it's actually, if I think about it too much, it's very scary, the state of our medical system as a whole. It's actually very scary and very, very sad. And it's something that at this point in my life, I really just try to avoid as much as possible, all of it. Like I don't really want anything to do with any of it. I've never been to a doctor and been like, wow, you just totally fixed what was wrong with me. Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, that was amazing ever. Like
You're
in my
so
life
right.
ever. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I remember, like you said, I really like what you said about how the more you go to the doctor, the more you go to the doctor. And I've really been working on that with myself lately because I think I had a lot of fear instilled in me with all the kidney stuff I went through and then the postpartum transfer and all that crap. And it like conditioned this look for an expert type of response in me. Like when I think something might be wrong, look for an expert. Like that was, I don't know, I somehow picked that up subconsciously within the last couple of years. And I really, really don't like it. And so I'm working on taking that out, but I wonder how much fear drives that return for people. You know, like you mentioned, okay, say you go in, they think they see something, you get a biopsy. Okay, well, now I have lingering pain. And I wonder how much of that is only, or at least mostly, like a fear, a creeping, fearful thought coming in. And it's like, oh, okay, well, I should go back because they saw X, Y, and Z. And you hear that all the time with ultrasound stories. Like I had heard that enough in like my first 6 months of pregnancy that I declined, like everyone, the doctors, and even my midwife were trying to get me to do extra ultrasounds after I had the kidney surgery, even though they did like heart tones and they did a non-stress test and all this other stuff. And they kept being like, you should really go basically like repeat your 20-week scan and do a full anatomy scan again. And I was like, at first I said yes. And then I ended up canceling it. And I'm like, no, because I have heard way too many times that if you're like looking for a problem, you're going to find it, you know, like low amniotic fluid or like, you know, the list is kind of endless and that just leads to more interventions. It's like a cascade of interventions in pregnancy, like before
Yes.
labor starts. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, my perspective is extreme, but I believe that it's not just fear, but I think that we are trauma bonded to the system. I think that from a very early age, I can think of the shots that we give little babies and little kids that are probably very traumatic to them. I think that we have traumatic things happen to us within the system. We have the person who's doing traumatic things to us within the system elevated to be a level of authority even above our own parents. We justify, it's a very human thing to justify what's being done to you that you don't like, but also what you allow to have happen to you, to justify it in some way. And I think that's our whole lives. And I think that we aren't really brought up with true body literacy, and we're certainly not taught. I mean, it's a rare woman that I know that's taught this, that we actually are the authority of our own body and we actually do know our body the best. And so, I mean, I can completely relate. I totally understand what you're saying when you say that you know, were feeling you needed to find an outside authority. Of course, that makes perfect sense, but that's like the soup that we're living in. But I think it's false. I don't think it's actually, I just think there's a better way. I don't know what the right way is. I don't know I don't know how I would have healed your kidneys. I don't have an answer for that, but I just know deep down inside there's something about the system that we have that is, it's actually actively harmful. And yeah.
Yeah, it's really, I think a lot of people don't like talking about this, or I know like people in my family I talk to about this, they find a way to dismiss it pretty quickly. Because I think it's so hard and so scary to
Mhm.
start to look at, because of how deeply rooted it is, how we're so like connected, right? Like we were talking about jobs and benefits and like you said, from the day you're born, they tell you to give your baby a hepatitis B shot. So-
For all the
what?
drug use that they're doing and the
And
promiscuous sex
the
they're
and the
having.
promiscuous sex. Yes, like what? So it's just, yeah, it's so deep. And so when you start to look at that, it gets really scary.
Yeah.
And yeah, it sucks. It honestly sucks. Like my husband and I still go back and forth on certain decisions, and it's still hard. It's still
Yeah.
hard, even though we feel similar to you probably with our viewpoints. And yeah, so I think it's just a long process that takes individual intuition to start to question and kind of peel back those layers. And for me, I know like people pleasing is super deep in there too. So like starting to unwind that, which feels like just a forever
Yeah,
process.
probably.
That's okay. It's probably still worthwhile. But no, I really appreciate everything you've shared today and all of your wisdom. And I'd love for you to tell people where to find you in the podcast. But before that, for if you could share any like parting words, especially I was thinking maybe for like first time moms or just like new moms out there, any other wisdom you have from all of your years of birth stories.
Oh my gosh, to new moms or new expecting to be moms, I would say please trust yourself. Please trust yourself as the authority above anyone else. Trust your intuition, tune into your baby. Please know that you know your baby better than anybody else. And if you start there, that will guide you so well through your pregnancy, through your birth, through your postpartum, and through mothering. You trust yourself. That would be the number one thing I would say. And I would say listen to birth stories. You don't have to listen to my birth story podcast, but as Caroline and I were saying earlier, I always tell people that I think the best way to learn about birth is to simply listen to other women's stories. And again, it almost doesn't really matter the type of birth story you're listening to, you're going to learn something. And you're going to learn something about your own body. You're going to learn something about the medical system. You're going to learn something about the midwifery system. You're going to learn a lot. So listen to birth stories. And as far as where you can find me, I am on social media at Healing Birth. So that's all one word, just at Healing Birth. My website is www.healingbirth.net. And the podcast is called Healing Birth, and it's on all podcast platforms, any place that you get podcasts. And Carolyn, thank you so much for allowing me to share. And thank you so much for having me on your show. And I'm so excited to share your story. There's something about the level of consciousness that you bring to your story that really touched my heart. And so to all your listeners, you'll get to hear that soon on my show as well.
Yay. Yes. Thank you for everything you shared, your transparency, and honestly, the work that you are doing, putting more birth stories out there, because like I said earlier, I really think the more you listen to, the more you can start to picture what you want your birth to look like. And you can't really be prepared, right? Because like we said, surrendering is such a big piece of it. But in a way, you can mentally be at a new level of readiness, I think, depending on whatever is going to come your way, whatever your baby's going to throw at you or the universe or all
Yes,
that. So seriously, thank you for sharing all of those stories and putting all of that out there.
my pleasure.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Hope you loved this episode. Share it with a friend, share it to your social media, and we'll talk to you next time.